My name's John Davies, and I'll introduce the first part of the evening, along with my colleague Leila Mimak over there. We're live streaming the event, so we won't film the audience. You can take photos if you want, but please don't take photos of other members of the audience. We're here to express our support for anti-war protesters who are now in prison in Russia. We, a group of actors who've come together to do this, will read excerpts from English translations of speeches made by 4 of these protesters in court. These are 4 of 12 translations that have just been published in the book by the door, Voices Against Putin's War. After the readings, which I expect will take us 40 minutes or so, we'll take another half hour or so to talk about the book. That discussion will be opened by Simon Pirani, who edited the book. There are copies here, and we hope you will buy it. Now, I want to tell you a bit about the 4 protagonists whose speeches we will hear tonight. The first one, Bogdan Ziza, is a Ukrainian artist, poet and activist from Crimea, who is now in prison in Vladimir, central Russia, serving a 15-year sentence. He is 30 years old. The second, Daria Kozyreva, is a Russian student, 19 years old, who is serving a 2-year, 8-month prison sentence in Vyborg, near St. Petersburg. The third is Igor Paskar, who is 49 and lived in Krasnodar in southern Russia. He's serving an 8.5-year sentence. He was in Yeniseysk, the northernmost of Russia's high-security prisons. Earlier this year, his supporters lost contact with him, but last month found him again in another prison in Krasnoyarsk. The final protagonist, Andrei Trofimov, is 58. He comes from Konakova, northwest of Moscow, and is now serving a 13-year prison sentence in Tver. 2 of these brave people, Bogdan and Igor, did superficial damage to property during their protests, but no hurt to persons. Like members of Palestine Action in this country, they were convicted of terrorist crimes. Daria and Andrei, on the other hand, are in prison for things they said and things they wrote on social media. In Andrei's case, for 13 years. Now over to Leila.
We could say much more about the harsh conditions in Russian prisons, but we want to get on and hear the words of these 4 people. I will just first draw your attention to the information sheet on your seats, which includes notes on some people and some things with which you might not be familiar with, and second, add a few words about Russia's court system. So-called terrorist offences are tried in military courts. Bogdan and Igor were tried in these courts, and Andrei, who ended up being tried twice, was 2 for his second trial. There are juries in some courts in Russia, but not for the so-called anti-state offences. None of our protagonists were tried by jury. Nevertheless, they did have the right, as do all accused in Russian courts, to make a final statement, the so-called last word. In fact, the Russian constitution says that the judge may not limit the time for this final statement and may not ask any questions while the accused is making this statement. Despite the fact that Russia has had one of the world's most fearsome legal systems going back to the 19th century, the right to the last word has remained. And Russian protesters and political movements have a long-standing tradition of using it. The populace of the late 19th century, who fought Tsarist autocracy, used it. Autocracy. The workers' movement that preceded the Russian Revolution used it. The Soviet dissidents of the 1960s and 70s used it. And this tradition is being continued in Russia today.
Now for our first protagonist, Bogdan Ziza. He lived in Crimea in Ukraine and was 18 years old in 2014 when Crimea was occupied by the Russian army in its initial assault on Ukraine. Bogdan worked in a cafe but put his creative energy into photography, street art and writing. In 2022, when the Russian war against Ukraine intensified with the full-scale invasion on 24th of February, Bogdan decided to make an open protest. On 16th of May that year, he poured blue and yellow paint the colours of the Ukrainian flag onto a municipal administration building in his hometown Yevpatoria that is used by the Russian occupation authorities. Bogdan circulated a video of his action which carried a message to Crimean street artists.
I'd like to address all the adherents of graffiti culture, all the vandals of Crimea, Russia and Belarus. I want to remind you that graffiti culture is, in the first place, about protest. And there'll be never more an appropriate time than now. The most horrific war has been unleashed by Putin and the machine of the state, and their propaganda is trying to convince people that everything is fine. They're trying to persuade people that there's no need to do a thing. That all we need to do is sit, observe, wait, and that anyway there is nothing you can do. But it's important, vital, now to get out on the streets and make our protests heard. And that those who are against the war, but who are sitting at home, scared to speak their minds, can see that they are not alone. We are many. We outnumber those who support this war. We have been robbed of any chance of coming out to protest during the day, but we can come out at night. I call on all of you to come out at night, come out to your courtyards, make your protest. Vandalism can sometimes be for the good, and this is such a time. No to the war.
Bogdan was arrested shortly afterwards in May 2022. He was in detention awaiting trial for more than a year, and in June 2023 he was brought before the Southern District Military Court in Russia at Rostov-on-Don, facing charges of committing a terrorist act, threats to commit terrorism, and vandalism motivated by political hatred. Yes, for throwing paint. These are the main points from Bogdan's final speech to the military court.
Do I regret what I've done? I'm sorry that I overdid it. No, my action resulted in charges under the article of the Russian Criminal Code on terrorism. I am sorry that my grandmother is now without the care and support that she needs. Apart from me, she has nobody. And I am sorry that I cannot now help others who are close to me who need that help now. As for the rest, I acted according to my conscience. And also according to my conscience, I do not deny or disavow what I did. I behaved stupidly and could have expressed my opinion in a other way. But did I deserve for what I did? To be deprived of my freedom for 10 years or more? I would like to appeal to the court. Do not follow the regime's script. Do not participate in these awful repossessions. But obviously that would have no effect. The judges are just doing what they're told in political cases like these. And for these reasons, I will continue to protest, even in prison. And I'm well aware of the sentence I may receive and how it may affect my health and my life. But am I worthy of the life that I live? Is each one of us worthy of a carefree life when we stay silent at a time when every day innocent lives are being taken? I want to read from a letter. This was the worst night of my life. For the first time in the war, there was a white glow. The sky was white from the explosions. It was as though we were in a trench, not in our own home. At one moment, I thought it was all flying towards us. There was a very clear sound of a rocket and then a very powerful explosion. But we have been lucky again, and we are still alive. That was a message from my sister in Kiev, who had to live through another night of bombardment on the city by the Russian armed forces. But for many people, this war that is going on now is happening over there, somewhere, far away. One of the staff at the pre-trial detention centre said to me, "Bloody hell, I'm sick of this war. Whenever you turn on the TV, it's more of the same. And everything is getting so expensive. the cost of running a car now. And that's the problem. Here in Russia, for you, this war is an inconvenience, an irritation. You try to wait it out. Living your usual life, trying to avoid bad news. And in that way, not valuing simple things like waking up in a warm bed, in a warm flat, and saying to someone who's dear to you, good morning. At a time when in our country next door, millions of people are losing their homes, losing their loved ones, when whole cities have been destroyed every day. And in theory, Russian people's failure to act could be explained. If it wasn't for the fact that it is Russians' hands that are carrying out the violence. The hands of those who bear arms and those who don't do anything to stop them are both Russian. And every day that an ordinary Russian person carries on reasoning that this is all politics and doesn't concern him and living his normal life, he adds money to the Russian Federation budget and in that way sponsors a criminal war. Of course, there are those who do not support what is happening, who take action, who are not silent participants. Journalists, various activists, those who refuse to stay silent. My action was a cry from the heart, from my conscience, to those who are afraid, just as I was afraid, for who do not want this war. Each of us, separately, are small, unnoticed people, but people whose loud actions can be heard. Yes, it is frightening. Yes, you can end up behind bars where I, for sure, did not plan to be. Even for these words, I could face a new criminal case, but it's better to be in prison with a clear conscience than to be a wretched, dumb beast outside. I am also an ordinary citizen of my country, Ukraine, who is not used to keeping quiet when confronted with lawlessness. I'm not alone here. There are more than 200 people with me, Ukrainian political prisoners serving time in Russian prisons on fabricated charges. Many of them are Crimean Tatars who once again faced with repression by Russia. I am myself and half Crimean Tatar, and it hurts me to see what people are going through right now. Many Ukrainians are serving time in Russian prisons simply because they are Ukrainians and were somewhere that the Russian state thought they should not be. In Russian prisons, people are beaten up for speaking in Ukrainian. Well, not even for speaking it, but simply for understanding it. Bastards amongst the guards at pre-trial detention centres or other places where our people are imprisoned address prisoners in Ukrainian to see if they can get a reaction, to see if they provoke an answer or response. If the person reacts, then they beat them up. And those who passionately seek Nazis in Ukraine have not opened their eyes to the Nazism that has emerged in Russia, with its ephemeral Russian world and with which armed forces have come to us and tried to exploitate Ukrainian identity. I'm no kind of terrorist. It sounds ridiculous to you to say that. I'm a person with morals and principles who would rather give his own life than to take the life of another person. But I am not ready to give my life to the Federal Penal Enforcement Service of the Russian Federation. I declare a hunger strike and demand that I be stripped of my Russian citizenship. And I demand that all Ukrainian political prisoners to be freed. If anything happens to me in prison, I want the world to know that it happened only because I am Ukrainian, who took a stand against the war in this country. And if this is my last word, let it be my last word in the Russian language. The last thing I will say publicly in Russian in this country as long as this regime lasts. The Red Regime.
And those were indeed Bogdan's last words before in Russian. He then performed a rap by Artem Loik in Ukrainian before being sentenced. Bogdan ended his hunger strike after some time, but continued to demand that his Russian citizenship be annulled, which it was in September 2025.
Our next protagonist, Daria Kozyreva, was first arrested for an anti-war protest in August 2022 in St. Petersburg. Together with a friend, she tore the letters Z and V, which are used as militarist symbols, from military vehicles on display in a park. The police were called. Daria was not charged because she was only 17 at the time. In December 2022, just after the Ukrainian city of Mariupol was bombed, resulting in thousands of civilians being killed, Daria painted a protest message on an installation in the shape of two hearts that claimed to represent St. Petersburg's friendship with Mariupol.
You murderers. You bombed Mariupol. You Judases.
It was the middle of the day. Daria was not hiding from anyone. She was arrested and charged with vandalism and damaged property. Then the police went to work, and she was charged with discrediting the army due to social media posts she had written before the law on discrediting the army had even been passed. In September 2023, she started studying for a medicine degree, but was excluded from university due to her protest actions. In an interview she gave then, she said,
They will not shut me up. It's beneath my dignity to keep quiet. Maybe the words I say won't change anything, but at least my conscience will be clear. I'll know that in 2022, 23 and 24 I didn't keep quiet. Maybe I'll leave the country. I don't resist that idea in principle. But for now, to leave in order to escape prosecution doesn't seem right. That's quite apart from the fact that I am sick of walking down the street and seeing banners advertising for contract soldiers to do real work. If I leave, it would be easier for me on a psychological level. But I am a patriot in the real sense, not in the sense that the propagandists give the word. I hope everything will change.
Then, in February 2024, on the second anniversary of the all-out invasion, Daria laid flowers and lines from a poem on the foot of a statue of Taras Shevchenko, Ukraine's national poet. And again, she was arrested for discrediting the armed forces. Yes, the flowers and a poem. In April this year, she was tried in the Petrogradsky District Court.
All rise.
Now we will hear the main points from Daria's final statement. She started by citing one of Taras Shevchenko's poems in Ukrainian.
Laugh then, ferocious foe, but not too loudly, for our fame will never be laid low.
I take it this is in Russian. The proceedings are in Russian. Could we have that in Russian?
Yes, it is a poem, and I will continue in Ukrainian. Our epic and our ancient song forever shall remain, and that is where our glory lies, the glory of Ukraine. If Taras Shevchenko was somehow transported into our time, I suppose I would be expected to say he'd be rather taken aback. But he wouldn't be, not at all. He'd recognise it instantly. Muscovy is at it again. Of course, the war didn't start in 2022. Even in the narrowest sense, the proper starting point is 2014. It was these same Russians then, the same ones responsible for every drop of spilled blood. In a broader sense, though, it's been going on for centuries. There is a striking feature in Russian history. No matter who holds power, whether czars or communists, the regime seems governed by a kind of religion that prevents it from simply leaving Ukraine alone. The rulers might be sporting different uniforms, but they're all cut from the same cloth. You would think that after so many centuries, they might have grasped the obvious. Just stop. Just let go. Yes, Moscow has won battles, many battles, but has never secured a final victory. And it never will. The Ukrainian people won't allow this. They've had enough. But those who believe in occupation never understood that. They're not as clever as they think. No one ever gave them the right to define Ukraine's past or future. They fail to see that Ukrainians do not need any big brother, and certainly not the fantasy of a so-called all-Russian imperial nation. If anyone tries to invade Ukraine, they will be fought, and it will probably be painful. I sincerely hope Russians will come to understand these basic truths. Ukraine, once again, is a free nation. It will choose its own path, and will choose who to call a friend or a brother and who to name as a bitter enemy. It will itself decide how to relate to its own history, and most certainly it will choose which language to speak. Even those who oppose Putin's regime do not always understand this. They do not realise that Ukraine, having paid for its sovereignty in blood, will determine its own future. I still want to believe that when Russia finally becomes democratic sooner or later, this attitude will change. I want to believe in a beautiful future where Russia relinquishes all its imperial ambition, whether overt and bloodthirsty or hidden deep in the human psyche, God willing. I already said during the oral arguments that it would be stupid to talk about shackles in the context of the current situation in Ukraine. Ukrainians will not allow themselves to be chained. But in Shevchenko's time, shackles were a grim reality. That's why you won't find his work. That's why you won't find in his work any rallying cries to fight the Muscovites.
Yes, Cousin River, please speak about the case before the court.
His patriotic poem is a lament for Ukraine's bitter fate, a lament for the forgotten glory of the Cossacks, a lament for the mistakes and defeats that cost Ukraine its freedom.
Please address the case.
But he truly believed that one day Ukraine's glory would return, that the ghost of its great hetmans would rise again, that the country would finally cast off the enemy's chains. He couldn't know when. He couldn't know that within half a century, the Ukrainian People's Republic would emerge on the map, that those same Ukrainian peasants who had not long before been bound in serfdom, deprived of rights, silent, would raise a national flag, that they would take up arms and, led by Petliura, go to fight the Bolsheviks and the volunteers. Sadly, the Bolsheviks won, and that was a tragedy, not only for the Ukrainians, but for many nations. Ukraine was left in the hands of a brutal executioner for another 70 years.
I have to interrupt again. This isn't a history class.
Let's speak of the present. The shackles have long been cast off, and no one will put them on Ukraine again. Putin still cannot grasp the concept of Ukrainian sovereignty. What he wants, really, is a meek and submissive little Russia. Ideally a province with no will of its own, which obeys its every word, speaks a foreign tongue, and slowly forgets its own. He miscalculated. He simply couldn't believe that his little Russia dream was gone forever. Ukrainians will not let their country be turned into that. Putin obstinately attempted this. In 2014, he annexed Crimea. He fueled the war in the Donbass, all with the same aim. And in 2022, he decided it was time to finish the job. On paper, it was a neat plan. A blitzkrieg, Kiev in 3 days. But 3 years haven't even been enough. And nor would 3 decades be. The invaders were kicked out of the outskirts of Kiev, forced to flee Kharkiv, and pushed out of Kherson. They didn't just fail to reach the capital. They still don't fully control even the areas they claim in the Donbass. Yes, part of Ukrainian land remains occupied. And yes, it may stay that way for a long time. Still, Moscow hasn't conquered Ukraine. The heroic Ukrainian people stood up to defend their homeland, and at the cost of countless lives, they held their ground. The national flag still flies over Kiev, and it always will. In early 2022, when the enemy was driven from the capital, Russia was left looking like a fool. Of course, I still dream that Ukraine will reclaim every inch of its territory. Donbass, Crimea, all of it. And I believe that one day it will. History will judge, and judge fairly. But Ukraine has already won. Victory is theirs. That's all I have to say.
Our next protagonist, Igor Kaskai, was arrested in June 2022. He painted his face the colours of the Ukrainian flag and threw an improvised Molotov cocktail at the stone porch of the Federal Security Service office in Krasnodar, southern Russia.
A plastic mat caught fire, but that was soon extinguished.
Igor stood and waited to be arrested. The police arrived, handcuffed him and took him into the Security Service's office. Later on, in an interview with human rights activists, Igor explained what happened next.
There were people in uniform, perhaps 6 to 8 of them. A sack was put over my head. The next few hours were among the very worst of my life. I was handcuffed, taken to some room, and they began to kick me. They put into my hands a grenade, or a replica of one, and said they were going to pull the pin. Then they attached rings to the middle fingers of both hands and started to send electric shocks through them. Then some very heavy guys sat on me so that I couldn't move, and they started to ask me about nothing in particular. They pushed down on me so hard that I couldn't breathe. They took my trousers off and tried to force some plastic object, presumably some sort of imitation phallus, into my anus. All this time the sack was over my head. The senior officers were not only well aware of these illegal activities, they were encouraging them.
Eventually, Igor was taken to the investigator of the case. He was charged with vandalism and terrorism. In May 2023, he was tried in the Southern District Military Court. This is his final statement in court.
Almost a year has gone by since I carried out this action. During that year, I pictured this moment time and again, the moment when I would be given the opportunity to make my final statement. I agonised over the words I would say and the motives that drove me. During the last sitting, Your Honour, you asked whether I regret my actions. I understood that the extent of my professed regret would influence the severity of the sentence. But if I renounced my beliefs, I would be acting against my conscience. On the contrary, during the time I've been in prison, I have seen firsthand the injustices perpetrated against the people who we call our brothers, both prisoners of war who have served in the Ukrainian armed forces and ordinary Ukrainian citizens. The war, or whatever term we use to label it, came to their homes, destroying their lives as they knew them. No matter what slogans and geopolitical interests we use to varnish this, in my eyes, it cannot be justified. Do I regret what has happened? Yes. Perhaps I'd wanted my life to turn out differently. But I acted according to my conscience, and my conscience remains clear. Rather than reflecting on who is right and who is guilty, I would like to pose this question. What did each of us do to stop this nightmare? What, 10 or 15 years from now, will we tell our children and our grandchildren about these troubled times? Unfortunately, God has not granted me the joy of fatherhood. The people who were closest to me have gone and I'm left alone. It was easy for me to do what I did, even though I was well aware of the consequences. There was no one to agonise about my fate, no one to worry about me or to cheer me on. But what I really didn't expect was the huge number of letters and messages of support that I've received. People have written from every corner of Russia, and not only Russia. Many were grateful for my position, so completely at odds with the notion of unanimous national support for what's being perpetrated. There were so many messages of encouragement. Stay strong. Don't despair. So many warm words, so much sympathy. This is from one letter. There is very little left of everyday life. It turns out that we can't live everyday lives anymore. I'm listening to the memoirs of prisoners from the 1930s, 40s and 50s. Right now, I'm on the breathtaking biography of the actress Tamara Petkevich, who spent 7 years in a prison camp. She was arrested in 1943 and lived until 2017. When they came for her, she was only 22. Just a girl, half the age I am now. I haven't read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, and I never got round to Shalamov's Kolyma Tales either. But now I'm listening to Petkevich, and it's making me realise that this is exactly what we must listen to, what we must read at school. As a country, we are obsessed with the past, but we hardly ever think about the present or the future. The Americans have their American dream, something to strive for. We have nothing but a fixation on that which happened long ago, that which cannot return. But time and again we try to bring back what has passed, and these attempts are absolutely pointless. It's as though the whole country is stuck in the mud. Reading these and other words sent to me in prison really touched me and pushed me to write this final statement to the court.
Our final protagonist, Andrei Trofimov, 58, was arrested in May 2022 in Konakova Tver region, northwest of Moscow, and charged with attempting to join a volunteer force fighting on Ukraine's side and was supporting extremism and discrediting the armed forces. In October 2023, he was tried at a closed hearing. The evidence consisted of copies of social media posts he had written. This was his statement in court, which he managed to communicate to opposition media based outside of Russia.
Honourable Court, I certainly did write on the internet everything referred to in the indictment. And I was right to do all that I did. I admit no guilt and do not repent. I publicly approve, heartily endorse and support the explosions on the Crimea Bridge in the autumn of 2022 and the attacks by Ukrainian drones on the Kremlin and other targets in Moscow in May 2023. Because Ukraine is a victim of aggression. And for myself, I demand the maximum possible prison sentence. Because I despise you. I will not share the same space with you or live in the same country as you. If I cannot go to Ukraine, then shut me up in prison forever. Victory will come all the same to those who are now, arms in hand, destroying Putin's scumbags. Glory to Ukraine. Putin is a dickhead.
Andrei was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, but that was not the end of it. Solely on the basis of the speech you've just heard, prosecutors brought fresh charges of justifying terrorism and discrediting the armed forces. In May this year, Andrei was tried again in the 2nd Western District Military Court. These are the highlights of his final statement there.
I was living quietly at the dacha with my cats and was a bother to no one. My life changed drastically on the 24th of February 2022. The reason for both the first criminal case and the current criminal case against me was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I will go on to explain why I regarded this event in that way. After all, it is for what I have said that I am in prison. I took no action in either the first case or the second. But this has been my way of being involved in the events because it was physically impossible for me to leave the country. And I have no desire to stay silent in this situation. I mean, it is my life. Why have I done this? I must respond to your remarks yesterday to the effect that my statements, including in court, could harm my own interests. Your Honour, I have no interest in a shorter sentence. What is the purpose of what I am doing? Writ large, it is a matter of self-preservation. It is just that I understand the instinct of self-preservation not as the preservation of the body per se, of its physical health, because I am not my body alone. I want to preserve my conscience in this difficult situation, my ability to tell black from white and lies from truth, and quite importantly, my ability to say out loud what I believe to be true. I have not just acted in this way since 2022. I've always tried to live this way. It is just that my desire to remain like this in such situations, that is, being able to tell the truth, to keep my conscience clear, is what causes such actions. In what has occurred since 24th of February, we see concrete evidence of a violation of Criminal Code Article 353, that is, the planning, preparation, unleashing and waging of a war of aggression. What have I done in this situation? Publicly, by staging a solo picket, I have demonstrated the Russian state's insanity. Look, the prosecution is asking for 15 years in total. The sentence given for murder. Although even for murder, sentences are often shorter. And yet my deeds harmed no one nor caused any damage. I believe this to be a demonstration of the state's insanity. The state happily displays this quality using me as an example. What have I done in response? I have shown fortitude. This is vital, because I hope that the Ukrainians can see what I do. Look at this. They arrested him. He was convicted and given 12 years of maximum security. Did they do a good job of convincing him of the error of his ways? That is, have I stopped doing what I was doing? Has my voice become less audible? No, it has not.
Andrei then talked about the charges brought against him. First for calling Putin a dickhead.
That was deliberate, to challenge the sacredness of supreme power.
Second, for writing approvingly in social media posts about the Ukrainian armed forces attack on the Crimea bridge.
The attack was not terrorism, but a legitimate military operation.
Third, for writing approvingly about a Ukrainian drone attack on the Kremlin.
That was aimed at the perpetrators of multiple war crimes and was also legitimate.
Then Andrei told the court that the prosecutors who brought unfair charges against him had also failed to bring more serious charges.
How should my actions be correctly characterized? I'm involved in the war on the Ukrainian side. It is just that this involvement takes place without weapons, because war is such an extraordinarily multidimensional event. In addition to the fighting in the steppes of Donbass, in the Black Sea, and in the skies above Ukraine, the war is fiercely fought in the information space by state entities, by Russian bodies and by the Ukrainian side. I am an information warrior. In what sense? On October 9th, 2022, I wrote and sent an email to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky asking him to grant me Ukrainian citizenship. I'm entitled to it because of my ancestry. All my grandparents hailed from Ukraine. Ukrainian law says that I have the right to Ukrainian citizenship. On 14th of April of this year, the Council on Political Prisoners of the Memorial International Human Rights Defense Committee published a decision designating me a political prisoner. As part of my work, I have used the criminal cases against me as publicity opportunities. The information war is a real thing. I am involved in it, and I'm trying to prove this now. Informationally, I support Ukraine and the armed forces of Ukraine. In fact, I have defected to the enemy side in an armed conflict involving the Russian Federation. This is the essence of the crime defined in Article 275 of the Russian Federal Criminal Code, high treason. I asked the court to send my criminal case back to the prosecutor, as the factual circumstances indicate there are grounds for charging me with a more serious crime. Try me for treason. I betrayed your deranged state.
Thank you. That concludes the readings. Now, Tom Rowley? Yes. We'll take over to chair discussion about the book, Voices Against Putins' War.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I think Simon's going to join me in just a moment. I want to say a big thank you to the actors for that, because that was really powerful and touching. So I think another round of applause. So I'm a journalist. I've worked a lot on Russia, Ukraine, the wider region over the past 10 years. And I'm just looking at my notes, and I'm really pleased to be here tonight. We are live streaming, but I believe the live streaming has now ended. So feel free to ask any question you like, and we know.
Well, it'll carry on while I'm talking.
It will carry on while you're talking, but then when the questions begin, you can ask any question you like, and everyone can forget about me afterwards. Simon's going to speak about the book, and then there will be questions. And at the end, I believe there will be an opportunity to write letters to Russian political prisoners. And I think our friend Pyotr, who can put his hand up, is going to help with that. I think that might happen down there. It might happen, we don't know. It will happen somewhere. And I think that's really important. Letters are incredibly important. Please can write one, or write two, or write three. There are also drinks and snacks served at the bar, for which you can make a solidarity donation. And also you can make a donation towards prisoner support. Prisoners need, there's the book, Voices Against Putins' War. And you can also make a donation to for food. I believe there's wine, beer, via Alessio. And again, please remind yourselves that political prisoners need huge amounts of physical and other kinds of things, and your pounds and pence will go towards people who do need it. So I encourage you to do that.
Thanks very much, everybody, for coming. I also want to thank the actors, and also thank all who helped to produce the book, Voices Against Putin's War. There's Nick Teplov, who did a really beautiful design. We had a team of translators, our copy editor, our friends at Resistance Books, the photographers who took the photos in court. Just the only one that was not taken in court is the one of Bogdan. The people at Media Zona, Memorial and Solidarity Zone, and others who didn't want to be named. So I first want to talk about the speeches in the book and the people who made them, and I'll then also say a bit about how we put the book together and what I think it's for. You've heard the words of 4 of the protagonists whose cases feature in the book, and there are 6 more who gave speeches in court, plus 2 who appeared in court but made their statements elsewhere in the media. And then there's a summary of 17 further anti-war speeches in Russian courts. And for this we have to thank the authors of the Poslednye Slovo website. That means last word, is a smashing website, and their stuff actually goes back to the speeches made at all points since the 1960s. They've got a very good coverage, particularly of the Crimean Tatar cases, of which there have been many in 2017-18 in particular. Now, all the statements, the anti-war statements, were made at substantial personal risk. No one can, not only can speaking forcefully encourage a judge to sentence a person heavily, it can lead to additional charges, as you've heard. And Andrei Trofimov, for example, the last of those 4, was tried again for what he'd said in the initial court hearing, and 3 years were added to his sentence. Daria Kozyreva also received additional punishment, a large fine, just for what she said in court. Now, the statements that you've heard this evening, and also the statements in the book, are not spontaneous or off the cuff. All those who made them thought very, very hard about what they would say, and I think we too should think about their words. One thing that struck me is that all the protagonists in the book address themselves primarily to their fellow citizens, not to the court asking for mercy, not to the government asking it to change course. Most of them knew that their supporters were in court to record their words and relay them to opposition media. And one of those who articulated specifically that their actions were addressed to Russian citizens is Bogdan Ziza, the first talk we heard today, who is Ukrainian. These final words in court are one of the last refuges of free speech in Russia. In 2022, in the months after the invasion, it became impossible to denounce the war by holding street demonstrations. There were a few demonstrations about the round of call-ups in September 2022, and after that, nothing. You couldn't speak in the media, you couldn't do other public actions. All the speeches you've heard were made after that, between 2023 and now. And now another thing that, working through these speeches, that struck me is the wide range of viewpoints from which these protagonists oppose the war in Ukraine. For example, you heard Daria Kozyrova here declaring herself to be a true Russian patriot and using the term patriot in the real sense, not in the way that state propagandists use it, and at the same time justified Ukrainians' defense of their land against Russia arms in hand, so as did Andrei Trofimov. And in the book there are the words of others who not only opposed the war but hoped for Russia's defeat. So there's Ruslan Siddiqui, an anarchist who decided to fight absolutely on his own, decided to fight on Ukraine's side and successfully derailed a train carrying munitions to the Russian army in Ukraine. He is serving a 29-year prison sentence. Another notable speech was made by Alexander Skorbov, who was first jailed for his political activity in 1977, when he was a member of one of the Soviet dissident groups that identified as socialist. Decades later, he was back in court, refused to rise when the judge entered court, and denounced what he called Putin's Nazi dictatorship and expressed a hope for Ukrainian victory in the war. Now, these views contrast with those, for example, of the artist Sasha Skochelenko, whose speech is in the book, and the municipal councillor Alexei Gorinov, who also actually made a number of speeches in a number of trials. He also was prosecuted for things he'd said actually in prison to fellow prisoners who turned out to be working with the authorities. They declared themselves to be pacifists, and they explained in court what that meant in a thoughtful and detailed way. Those people are political activists who work, not Sasha Skochelenko, but the others I've mentioned, are political activists who worked out their positions over many years. But then if you take Igor Paskar, whose speech you heard today, who firebombed the security police headquarters in Krasnodar, before the invasion of Ukraine, he had attended a few protest demonstrations, but he wasn't really involved in any political movement. And he decided, as you heard, on his own to make a protest that he knew would result in imprisonment. In fact, he stood there, he didn't move after he'd thrown this firebomb. He waited for them to come and arrest him. So he said in his speech, again you heard it, that he did it because he believed it would be immoral to stay silent. So I think it's just worth pausing to think about that kind of morality. Now a bit about how the book came together. So in the summer of 2022, soon after the invasion of Ukraine, a group of Russian activists, some in exile, some in Russia, came together to support political prisoners with an emphasis on those who'd taken those direct actions, such as the throwing of these firebombs. This small grassroots collective, Solidarity Zone, worked alongside more established organizations such as Memorial, which is really Russia's oldest NGO, set up at the end of the Soviet period to remember the political prisoners of the Stalinist time, but also fighting for political prisoners now. So Russian friends contacted people here, and a small group of us started translating Solidarity Zone's appeals for funds to finance legal fees, support for prisoners' families, and so on. And in 2023, we started seeing these speeches in court, in Solidarity Zone's social media, on Russian opposition websites. There were well-publicized cases of Russian politicians such as Ilya Yashin, who were jailed for denouncing the war. But there were all these others, like Igor Pascal. That's the first speech that came to my attention at that time. And these were hardly known in the West. And these are the people whose actions we sought to highlight in the book. Because there's no open protest, but there is protest, and it's expressed in these speeches by these individual actions. Okay, I've got three more things I want to say about what the book is for. The first is the small number of cases it describes are a microcosm of a gigantic mountain of repression and violence, in the first place in the Ukrainian territories occupied by Russia and in Russia itself. And I wrote a chapter at the end of the book trying to summarise the extent of the killings, the disappearances, the arrests, the imprisonments, the torture. And the chapter heading I use is the 21st century Gulag, and I thought about that a lot and decided it's absolutely no exaggeration. And just to consider one number, which is the number of political prisoners, Memorial keeps a list which in 2015 had fewer than 50 names on it. In 2021 it had 420 names on it, and now it has more than 3,000 names on it. Now that compares with the Soviet Union under Brezhnev, so in the 70s, when historians estimate there were between 5 and 10,000 political prisoners. But don't forget that population-wise, Russia is half of, or was half, of the Soviet Union. That's the first point. The second point concerns the commonality between those who oppose the war in Russia and those who've poured onto the streets here and in the US and Western Europe in protest at our government's support for the Israeli genocidal onslaught on Gaza. Although the repressive machinery in Russia is more powerful, the logic of repression faced by protesters, to me, is eerily similar. The mendacious claims that people are terrorists or justifying terrorism. But there's much more than that in common between these anti-war movements, even if people on both sides, some people on both sides, do not think so. Both of these anti-war movements rose up to assert humanity against the absolutely inhuman actions of rotten empires and their servants. And there needs to be a real conversation between these movements, and that's hard work. And I hope that the book and the readings you've heard could become part of such a conversation. My third and final point is that I hope the book will encourage people to give practical support to political prisoners in Russia. You can write to them, which usually for non-Russian speakers is not practical, but our Russian friends here have perfected a system, including translation, and they'll tell you about that at the end of our discussion. That's one thing you can do. You can give money. What we collect here today, and there's a can over there if you have cash, or there are phones with the relevant apps if you have cards. And what we collect here today will be split between the support group for Bogdan Ziza, the Fires of Freedom group that supports Ruslan Siddiqui, that's the guy who sabotaged the train and is doing 29 years, and Solidarity Zone that supports Igor Pascal and many others. There are also other organisations listed in the book that deserve your support, and in fact, Resistance Books, the proceeds from sales will go to Memorial Support Political Prisoners organisation. Okay, and finally the thing you can do is to help make these cases more widely known, to bring them into that discussion, perhaps by organising events like this or in other ways that you can think of. And I'll stop there.